Hi, my name's Dave Adams, and you are watching Nerds of Wisdom. In my last video, I talked about Pandemic and the systems that made it the game that it was, which you can check out that last video in the description below. I wanted to pick up on that concept and run with it just a little bit further and just give a general idea of the sorts of things I'm talking about when I talk about the systems in games. I guess what we could say is that all games can essentially be boiled down to a collection of systems where the individual components compile together to make something that is greater as a whole. That said, it's important to realize that systems work on varying levels in a game. And just like I talked about with the Magic Circle, the idea of systems doesn't just relate to certain mechanics within the game, although they are very much a part of systems. I guess the best way to do this is to try and take a game and look at what we're talking about. The game I've chosen for today is Onitama. Now let's assume that you knew nothing about Onitama, and perhaps some of you don't know anything about the game, but if I told you that Onitama was a 1v1 combative game, would that really describe to you the fullness of what Onitama is? What if I went on to say that it's almost a bit like chess? You might start to get a picture or an idea, but that really wouldn't give you an understanding of how to play the game yet, or even what the different components in the board are. And it's not to say that that's not giving you some idea, and in fact, that's how we generally describe games to each other. We talk about mechanics, we talk about what games they're like, and intentionally so, because it does provide some picture, even if it doesn't capture the fullness of the experience. Now, one of the things we look for in games is that these games are unique, even when they're using mechanics which are similar to other games. For instance, I could say there's deck building and combat in Legendary Encounters and Alien Deck Builder, as well as Cry Havoc, but I wouldn't say that they are at all similar games. I'd say that they are vastly different, and for good cause. Each of those games is made up of their own individual systems that all coalesce together to form a completely different whole. So when we come to Onitama, let's start to look at how we would break these systems down. And the first thing that we'd want to look at is the objects themselves. Now in Onitama, you're going to have a player board which looks something like this. You're going to have cards which look like that, and you're going to have player pieces which look like that. Now, as yet, there's no real reason why these things are related or even together at all, until we start to describe the rules and the systems and the interrelationships. The interrelationships are part of the systems at play. The interrelationships talk about why this piece works with this piece and how it all goes on this piece. So these are the objects, and the systems also help us to work out how these objects relate. It also identifies their role and function. And so it's important for me to know that this piece here is also vastly different to this piece. If this piece gets taken and removed from the board, game goes on. If this piece gets taken and removed from the board, game over. The systems dictate the interrelationships between the objects, but they also inform me my relationship with these objects, how to use them, how that function works. As an example, there's absolutely no reason for me to have this card except in this game. I wouldn't have a function for it outside of this game. And outside of this game, those symbols wouldn't tell me anything. They wouldn't mean anything. I might confuse it for some strange Tetris game done on cards, I don't know. But there's no cause for this. It's the systems that tell me as a player what my relationship to this card is, what my relationship to these pieces are, how I'm to interpret the board. Of course, there's another layer to all this, and that's the very cultural systems that in which this game exists, and that is that the fact that it is a game, and that culture dictates that it be treated as a game. If I was to say, take this to a military scenario, and suddenly I'm using objects such as dots on a screen, or I'm using countdowns, and I'm using certain mathematical equations, suddenly those objects start to form a different meaning. And even though I might use the word game, war games are essentially simulations. The relationships, the cultural exploitation of a simulation is vastly different to this sort of game. So even though we could still use the word games, the cultural scenario changes and dictates the nature in which these games should be viewed. Now, what we've looked at is just games in the context, in the cultural context of gaming or the gaming hobby. But if I said that this game suddenly was to determine which player would win and which player would die, that cultural context, that context of the game, the relationship of the players to the game has suddenly shifted, and this game's taken on a whole new other meaning. Now, I'm not going to go too far into that and start to peel back the layers, but it's just important to note that when games are designed, they are designed for cultural situations. I think a key illustration of this was with the game Five Tribes, which had slave cards as a part of the core game. This led to many people protesting the game itself, writing to the designer, complaining about the game, taking issue with it, and then a big debate over whether this was appropriate or not. The main argument being for those defending the game that this was just culturally what happened at the time, that we shouldn't deny the history that went on, and that playing the game doesn't actually make me a slave owner. It's just about understanding context, and it's about respecting what happened in that time and that place. Whereas others brought forth the idea that these are practices that get condoned and passed down through social memes by participating in these things and just normalizing them through things where we play them as games. Because there's nothing in the game itself that makes having slaves a disadvantage or demonstrates why slavery is poor. They in fact are an advantage in the game if you use them at the right time. So there's different sides of the debate, and what it does highlight that these are games made within cultures and for cultural agendas, and that the cultural agenda will shape the way that we view the game, and that the game in a sense helps us to reflect our culture. Now, there are other levels. We can pull this whole screen back and we can start to look at all the different ways in which objects, interrelationships, or the attributes, all these cultural layers can have on systems and how systems interrelate, but we're just going to focus on this very basic idea of how these systems work for this game in this scenario on a very simple level. We're not going to go too far too fast. This is just meant to be a very quick overview. Let's look at the different components of the game. And in the game, we've got our master pawn, we've got our smaller pawns, we've got our board, we've got our archway. You can see the grid pattern set up on the board, and we've got our, of course, different movement cards right here. Now, when I said that this was like a chess battle, well, it is, and it's a fair description. I've got components. I've got two master components, which you could call kings if you wanted. I've got pawns, which have exactly the same name as a chessboard. And we've got a chessboard grid-like pattern which is set up. However, this is clearly not chess. And so to say that this is chess would be doing a disservice to the game. Now, the way you're going to play is you take your movement card and you choose which pawn you want to move, and you don't have to reveal this until you actually do the move. But that black spot will represent whichever piece you're moving. And that means that you can move on the board in that fashion. In this case, we can move one piece side one and forward one. What we're describing here is not just the system of that the rules of the card tell me how to move my pieces. We're saying that these pieces themselves are objects. This is an object, this is an object. Their attributes tell me what they are in the game. These pieces are attacking pieces, and I can use them both defensively and attackingly. This is my master pawn, which I can use both as an attack piece or as a defensive piece. However, it's also the piece that determines my overall victory of the game. It's my king in a chess-like sense. These are movement cards, so that's their object. Their attribute is that they tell me how to move my pieces. What we then start to discuss is the interrelationships of these things. My master pawn protects my archway. If this master pawn gets to that archway, I lose the game. If I can get my master pawn to this archway, I win the game. I'm using these pawns to protect and defend my master pawn and my archway. They have a relationship to each other. The squares have a relationship to the pawns, in that the pawns can only move in this gridded area. If a movement card would take me outside of a gridded area, I can't make that move. These have a relationship to the pawns, but they also have a relationship to the board, in that the different squares talk about the squares on the actual board. As a movement card is played, it switches with this floating card. So let's say I played that card, I'd place that in the middle, this card would then come to me, and that means that that piece is now available for my opponent when they make a move and switch the cards over. Now that's a system of play that provides me information as a player. It talks about how these cards work. It talks about how these cards relate to each other. It also talks about how these cards relate to me as a player. As a player, I know that all this information is known information. It says that my opponent knows everything about the moves I can make, possibly make, will make in the future. It also allows me to set up plays. If I've got a card that I think is particularly powerful, it might teach me to say, well, actually, I should hold on to that card and try not to use it so as not to give that power to my opponent, but to save it for myself when I can most make use of it. So now we've got objects, we've got relationships between objects, and we've got relationships between these objects and myself, the player. And the systems dictate what we do with these pieces, how they all interact, and what the role and the function of the game are. The rules instruct me on how to use those systems. So in a sense, the game is far more than the rules. It's these systems at play that make the game interesting. It's these systems at play that help me function and make sense of the game and teach me as a player what my relationship to these pieces are. If I lose this piece, not a big deal. If I lose this piece, game over. If I can take this piece, they lose. If I can get my piece down here, they lose. I win. However, realizing that all objects in the game are communicating something to us, realizing that the very way that they interact is all part of what the design process needs to entail, realizing that what we're doing is not just writing rules when we design games, that rules themselves aren't necessarily the key component. It's understanding the systems themselves, how the objects interact and interrelate to each other will ultimately bring about the rules themselves, because the rules should be dictated by how you want these things to relate to each other, whether how you want these two objects to work, or how you want one to impact the other, or how you want the players to interact with the objects. Having rules on their own without any sense of the systems and what you're trying to achieve will tend to degrade the sorts of experiences that you're going for. Understanding that, however, can mean refining and defining that process until you have a really good game that brings together an experience for a player that they'll walk away remembering. So when we're looking at systems and game design, we're looking at those key functions, those objects in the game, the different components and what they are, their attributes and what they mean within the game, their interrelationships of how they interact with each other and how us as players interact with them. And then to some extent we're also looking at the cultural expectations of a game. On a brief note, as people who are looking to game design or who are looking to be players, understanding these elements will either help you with knowing how to create a game or help you with identifying what is key to a game to build strategy, or to focus on which mechanics are going to be best suited to helping you achieve your goals. All games are just systems, small little individual systems that work together and function to create a greater whole that's different and means more than any individual system on its own. And so I hope that when you go to either be a player or a designer, that those systems will start to become more apparent to you and you'll start to understand the games that you're playing just a little bit better. But look, thanks for watching. Of course, this week, please check out everything else that we're doing, whether it's our designer diaries, whether it's the core mechanic coming out next week, or even if it's just going and checking out Gamerpalooza, gamerpalooza.com.au, which is where I'm writing some of my articles and putting up my thoughts and ideas and writings on the metagame. It's worth going and checking out. Link in the description below. Until next time, if you like what we're doing, please hit that like button. If you're new here, please hit that subscribe button. My name's Dave Adams. You've been watching Nerds of Wisdom.